You are listening to ESL Talk, a podcast made for English teachers by English teachers.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of ESL Talk. I'm Faye.
And I'm Daniel. We hope you enjoyed our last episode, all about building community, and we hope you now know where to go to find guidance and support on your teaching journey in the future. Today, we will discuss how to build your own online English course for teaching English online.
And our guest, Vero, will tell us about her journey with building, creating, and maintaining an online course at the university level.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear her steps and advice on getting started building a course, as she's someone who got a head start on a lot of us. And obviously, I'd like to hear from you as well, Faye. So let's get started with our episode topic today. So Faye, can you tell me a little bit about your experience planning, developing, and building an online course?
Sure. Yeah, that's actually very fresh on my mind because I just launched my first online course last week. I did all the registrations for the course that is starting in about a week. And it was definitely a lot more work than I anticipated it being. I started out with an idea. I really wanted to create a course to help students at a more advanced level who are thinking of living abroad or in an English-speaking country. And my idea was to provide them with those a real life example of language and grammar and vocabulary. So I started with this idea, and it was not really something I could base on anything else. I didn't have any books to go from. It was mostly based on my experience as a teacher and as someone who lives in an English-speaking country. And so it took me a long time to plan and develop the course curriculum. And then basically deciding how I wanted to structure that. So my course is actually a mix of recorded video lessons, and they're going to be live lessons to review. And it's designed to be a 4-week course with a 4 weekly live lessons as a way to review and practice. So it's sort of a mix. And I use this platform called Thinkific that's actually from Vancouver to host it. So that's also been a learning curve, learning how to host and edit and all that. So I might have done things a bit differently if I had known what I was getting myself into. Mm-hmm. How about you, Daniel? What has your experience been like?
Yeah, I haven't built an online course like you have, just because of the time and the effort that it takes. But it is something I'd like to do in the future, to have all my content and material somewhere where students can access it easily. Mm-hmm. But what I have done is I've built my own resources in terms of slides or Word documents or images or, interactive activities. So I do have courses that are separated. And with my online teaching, I do offer 5 different courses, which are all kind of planned, designed, have activities, homework, everything's all there. And it can be easily kind of adjusted and adapted for my learners. So again, a very time-consuming process. And there is a plan in the future to bring all that to an online platform called Genially, which I've worked on a little bit. And I think if I can get it there, then that's kind of the next level for me. Not an online course as such, but just a hub to have all my online resources and to make them as engaging and as attractive as possible for my students. So can you tell me what it was that led you to developing your online course? Why did you choose a course as a solution for your students?
I had been already putting up free content similar to my course content on Instagram, but I felt that, first of all, on Instagram, we have to do short snippets, right? So short videos. The format doesn't really lend itself to a long video explaining things and getting into grammar and all that. So I felt the need to do that. And also, that was my way to monetize my work, right? I've been creating all this free content. So I felt like I could kind of kill the 2 birds with one stone, developing my videos a bit more, going deeper into it, but also monetizing that a little bit. So that was sort of the idea behind it. And there seemed to be a lot of interest from students in having something that was more in-depth like that. But like I said, maybe what I would maybe suggest to other teachers that are starting on that, like doing courses online, is maybe starting small would have been better. Doing something that was a little bit more modular, or maybe not offering as many perks with it, and charging maybe not as high a price that I charge, because I mean, it's definitely reasonable for the amount of content you get, but it's also not accessible to everyone because we're working with international students, right? So I got a good group of students actually for this first try, but I think, it was just a lot of work, a lot of effort and time invested into one thing. But again, this is something I can do it again, right? I can launch it.
Right. That's what I was going to say. I guess now you have it all set up and running, you can kind of adapt it and modify it, and you don't have to just do separate standalone classes. Hopefully now that time is in there, it should be a little bit better for you.
Exactly. That should be the motivation for most of us trying to create this type of course, right? Yeah. And how do you deliver your courses without using an online system like that?
Yeah. So again, it is something I want to have available in the future, but right now, I really enjoy delivering, my classes. So my courses are done kind of periodically. So if you're a student, you'll sign up for 10 or 20 or 30 classes. And then I will structure a course based on those 10, 20, or 30 classes. So let's imagine, Faye, that you want to bring your IELTS score from a 6 to a 7. What we'll do is we'll have a 30 class program where we will spend time on each skill. We'll build in assessments, tests, quizzes throughout that. That's in my program. Again, it's kind of a set schedule, but I can tweak it and modify it because I have a lot of extra stuff in there. So it's not an online system because I think for skill building and speaking, especially, I think having that feedback is really important, and for writing as well. So that's one reason why I'm a little bit hesitant to do it all online. But I do feel like having an online platform as a support or alongside the physical teaching will definitely help as well. But it's just, again, very difficult to get the content. So when it comes to content, Faye, where do you find your content, and how do you create content for your English course?
Yeah. So like I said, a lot of it was based on the things I noticed from experience from my 14 years of teaching with students. I've prepped a lot of students for exams, as well as speaking exams, and also a lot of business English, and just seeing what the difficulties were for students. So I would basically think of students struggle to say something in different ways or to communicate in a variety of ways. They usually tend to use language that's very simple, that gets the point across. But then when they live abroad, they realize, why can't I speak that way? They lack that confidence. So I definitely pulled from different sources when I was looking into what the general topics were that I wanted to cover. And I included vocabulary and grammar lessons in there. So for the grammar lessons, I definitely based it more on grammar books, grammar books focused on exam prep that were more the level I was looking for. And that's more of sort of like a review of grammar. But the rest of the content was mostly based on my experience, really. So for instance, the first week of my course is how do we talk about problems? So the first lesson is when a problem first appears, what can you say? So, we have a situation, something has come up. I need some help. Right? And that's like, usually students will say that. We have a problem. That's it, right? So what are other ways we can say that? So I basically just brainstormed a bunch of ideas and things, situations that students might be in the workplace and in their day-to-day life. And that was basically how I started. But that's what I mean. That was a lot of work. So absolutely. Maybe if you don't have all that experience, definitely pulling from different sources, which we've talked about in the past before, right? Yeah, pulling from different books and things that are already out there, and just kind of like adapting it all and customizing it all. Where do you find your content? Like in your case, you do more skills-based teaching as well, right? So do you go anywhere specifically for that?
Again, like you've mentioned, because I've just collected and processed and adapted so many materials over the last 10 years, it's great to just have that kind of, I guess, that bank of resources to rely on, and I can kind of pull things out of there and adapt them and tweak them and modify them and just make them, as useful for my learners as possible. So again, I don't really use textbooks as such. There might be elements or structures from a textbook that I might use, but again, I don't want to kind of use textbooks alone. Again, there's some activities and exercises from textbooks that are really useful, so I might use those. But again, it just depends on the course and it depends on my learners. For example, I do a reading course with younger students. And of course, for that, there are books that I use, which are kind of, there for teaching, that are really colorful and really easy to follow and have, a lot of activities with them. But also when it comes to like speaking and conversation, I might find good articles from lots of different places. So with students, I'll send them an article. We'll discuss the article. We'll talk about it. We'll do activities based on it. We'll look at vocabulary, grammar, but I usually base that around the student's interest or the student's need. I won't just have a set article. So again, we can get
catered,
those.
Right? In your case.
Yeah, exactly. Because I don't want to teach a student who has a business, interest. I don't want to teach them about food. Whereas other students who maybe are really interested in traveling, I might want to teach them about tourism or culture. So it kind of depends on the student's needs, but I have the model there. I can just change the material around it. So that's kind of how I adapt it. So it sounds really exciting that you have this, you developed this amazing online course and you're already getting students and, it seems to be going really well. So how are you going to develop this in the future? Like, what are your plans going forward and how are you going to build those courses?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna, there are two things I'd like to do in the future. Like with this course that I just launched, I definitely want to launch it again in a couple of months because I like to do closed groups of enrollment so that I can have more, give them more attention individually as well. But I would definitely launch it with the same content, but maybe with different options for students. So different price points as well. If you just want the recorded lessons, this is the price. If you want to have some live sessions as well, this is a little bit additional. And if you want one-to-one feedback, a little bit more. So that's, I think, where I see the current course I have going in the future. And I've also been looking more into other platforms where I can do webinars, more like one-off sessions, sort of like an Instagram Live, but paid for a small fee. Because this is sort of like what Kate was talking about last episode. If you charge students something, even if it's a tiny little bit, you definitely filter out people that are just there because it's free and don't really care about the content. So I definitely want to maybe charge a small fee just to have those people that are really serious about it and build that community more. So yeah, I think that's more where I see myself going, is just doing more live webinars and things like that in the future. Yeah. How about you?
Wonderful.
What are your plans?
Yeah, again, like I said, I want to try to transition all my materials from slides or PowerPoints and Word documents because they're kind of, from the year 2000, maybe in some cases. So how do we develop those and adapt those? Because it's all about engaging learners, keeping them switched on and keeping them kind of engaged and kind of interested in the material. So that will be the plan. And if I can have a resource bank or an online platform for students alongside that, then I think the sky's the limit and lots of potential. But of course, it takes time and that takes money, which is not always in endless supply. So yeah, it sounds like we've both got a lot of exciting plans going forward. So having said that, let's now move on to the next portion of today's episode and let's bring in our guest Vero, who's going to tell us a little bit about her experience in building, developing, and planning an online English course.
Hi, Vero. It's so great to have you here. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, thanks for inviting me. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Vero. So we're going to get started today, as we usually do, by asking our guests to tell us a little bit about their teaching journey and where you are today in your journey.
Well, my teaching journey was a bit accidental. I don't know how many people have a similar experience. Yeah, initially I trained as an anthropologist, and then I was doing research in the Czech Republic and just fell in love with the country and wanted to move there. But turns out that learning Czech it was a very difficult progress, and it took me way too much effort. So I ended up teaching English at a language school because I think I kind of prepared a little bit in advance to have a backup plan, I suppose. So before moving there, I kind of did a bit of research and I thought I'll do a TEFL certificate. So I have this kind of cushion to fall on before I show up and potentially not be employed in my field of study. And I was right. Anthropology was fairly, Czech based and I couldn't speak it very well. So I ended up getting this job. So it was a language school called Szkola Park. Shout out. I don't know if anyone's from there or heard of it. But yeah, we were doing like Cambridge tests. So all these FCE, CAE courses, very ESL based adult night classes. And then I think I taught kind of business. Well, I taught 2 businesses off-site in the mornings as well. But I really, really enjoyed it because I think anthropology was very lab-based, and, you know, it wasn't a lot of interaction with, because I was working with human skeletons and we didn't talk very much. And I found the classroom to be a lot more entertaining. And I thought they were kind of foundation students getting ready to go on to their bachelor studies. I was quite young. They were kind of close to my age as well. So we gelled very well as well. After 2 years of that, I felt like I had this imposter syndrome where I felt like the TEFL certificate wasn't quite enough. So I said I'd come to Nottingham and get my master's degree to become a real teacher. So I did an applied linguistics and ELT master's at University of Nottingham. Halfway through my master's that I was doing full time, I got employed part time at the International College across the road teaching EAP. So I kind of fell into EAP really accidentally because they really needed a teacher and I really needed a job. And I kind of learned on the job. And then since, obviously, I've kind of grown a bit more. I've taken jobs at other universities and taught several EAP kind of pre-sessional programs and things like that. I've worked for University of Nottingham as well, for the language center. Yeah, I've just kind of, you know, through CPDs, through talking to other people, through research, through things like that, I just kind of slowly getting better, and the little syndrome is still there. And
I think it affects most of us too. Like it resonates with our journeys as well. Mine especially, feeling like I need to really know what I'm teaching and I need to do more. I think it's a teacher thing, being a perfectionist and having imposter syndrome. Our listeners can let us know if they agree, but
it's a very common theme that seems to come up.
And in terms of building courses, how did you start that? Like, how did you fall into that position?
Yeah, definitely. So I think that was just a bit of an accident again. So I feel like I just keep falling into lucky accidents from one to another. But yeah, it was just at the beginning of the pandemic, where I've always had an interest in technology, so I can just kind of backtrack a little bit. So I've always, I don't know if it's like being an elder millennial or whatever it is, I've just kind of always felt the need to kind of bring my laptop into the classroom if we didn't have any technology there, or to kind of find some sort of ways to integrate it a little bit. And then when it came to, before the pandemic hit, I just had an interest in using Microsoft Teams to kind of create a bit better group cohesion with my students, because I wanted them to have an online space where they could share things like what to do in Nottingham. They can organize trips together, because I know, like, in the context that I taught, there were students from China, then we had Saudi students, and they weren't really clicking together. The Chinese students had their WeChat, which was the app where they would work together and text, but they wouldn't include the other group. So I thought Teams would be a place where we could all kind of be together and be a bit more inclusive, and it worked. So I thought that went really well, because this was before any one of us had transitioned online, but I just created a little page for our classroom, and then it kind of spread. So other classes wanted to join into this thing, and we created teams for them, and they were organizing trips together and posting about University of Nottingham events. And I'd kind of post things as well. We had like additional resources where we would post things to help with writing, with research and things. So we had like separate channels for different purposes. The word spread through the center a little bit. And then when the pandemic hit, I didn't really build the course myself. I can't take credit for that, because it was a team effort, but they just kind of picked my brain about what I'd done with Teams. And then it was me and my other colleague, Lauren Chow, who kind of took an interest in this as well. And the two of us teamed up and worked together, and we basically helped put the center online. So it was more of a transition rather than building it from scratch. We just looked for ways to, I don't know, move online in response to the pandemic.
So tell me, Vero, when you were going through that process of kind of putting everything together and you know, putting in all the different pieces of that, what elements did you need to consider, or what was the process in kind of deciding what we should have and what we shouldn't have in that online course?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I think a big part was kind of restructuring the course altogether, because we were dealing with different time zones. We were dealing with, you know, kind of screen time and things like that. So we couldn't really replicate what we were doing face-to-face anymore. So we had to kind of adopt a flipped learning approach. So we had to modify the materials in that way. But I think that was part of it. Part of it was also understanding the technology. So I think that was very difficult, because when we were creating materials, we realized that, things like instructions like sharing your screen or using the chat function or posting in a channel. So all of these needed restructuring, because on paper, when you hand out a sheet of paper in a classroom, you don't really need to specify that. And so that was one element of it. Another was kind of creating separate spaces, again, for resources, for tutor support, for student socialization, and kind of having these separate spaces for that. So it's been a bit, I think there were so many elements to kind of put together. It was really overwhelming. But again, we kind of trialed and errored and somehow survived and came on top, and the pre-sessional worked and it went ahead, but it was a team effort. Like I said, it wasn't just me and Lauren. There were many other people contributing on the materials. So I think that was probably the biggest.
We know that, you had this whole team and you were basically moving your content online, which really helped. But what do you think some teachers that are starting out now making their own online courses, what do you think they need to make sure they have to have that course be successful?
Yeah, okay. So I think obviously, first of all, a stable internet connection. I think that's probably the biggest thing that, honestly, because I think you don't realize how much bandwidth we use when we're teaching, especially if you're trying to go beyond just having a conversation, like video, changing your background, sharing your screen, having a PowerPoint, any sort of like interactive apps that you can use within Teams. They take a lot. So I think just making sure that your internet is up to speed to keep up with all of this, and your laptop or technology, whatever you're using to do this. But then again, kind of looking at ways to make, because online classrooms are not the same as face-to-face. We all kind of have to agree with that. And some love it, some hate it. But there has to be an element, I think, at least, of being interactive and keeping your students engaged. So I think depending on how strict you want to be with it, I think it is important to make sure that your students have their cameras on, that you create some sort of connection with them at whatever level possible, keeping that humanity in the online classroom, because I feel like sometimes it disappears. People get away with a lot, kind of, I'm online so I can slack off. But it's not a distance course. It's an online course in response to a crisis. So we have to kind of adapt in a way that, because it's completely new, I would argue that it's not the same online course that we would have before the pandemic.
Yeah.
What we're doing now. So maybe paying attention to that would be a good idea.
That's a really good point. Yeah. I think even when we pay for courses or we sign up for things, or as part of a training course at our work or through our university, we tend to, sometimes some of us, we might just go through things quite quickly. How do I do this in the quickest way possible? We might not necessarily cut corners, but maybe not take the time that we need to really, engage with the material. So it's tricky. And I think, again, you brought up some really good points, Vero, about keeping it engaging, keeping it, relevant, and trying to make sure we think about the learner as well in that process.
I was just thinking, related to what you just said, that it's important not to just expect our students to learn from the course, but expect us to be learners as well, in terms of adapting to the technology, because there's always something coming up. And so it's kind of a race against time in a way, trying to keep up with, because if you want to learn if you want to build a course online, for example, you have to kind of know about the platforms, you have to know about the features, and then you have to think about them in an educational point of view of how would you adapt these. Oftentimes, these are not developed with teaching in mind, they're developed with an IT perspective. So they need to be kind of applied in a way that is educational, valuable from an educational point of view.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So just on that note, which platforms or which systems might be a good place to start for online English teachers? Because, we've seen in our experience, and obviously, we've worked together, and a lot of teachers are quite overwhelmed. They don't know, how do I do this? Where do I start? What do I click? So what could be some easy places that teachers can begin when they start building their own courses?
Maybe I'm biased, but I really like Teams. I think Microsoft Teams, I'm not sure about Google Classroom, but I think between the two, I've used Zoom before as well. On Teams, you have a place for a classroom. There's spaces for uploading documents, for sharing links, for it feels a bit more personal to me. It feels a lot more like a classroom where you would have shelves and storing things. Whereas with Zoom, I found it very difficult to share documents, to store links. You can save, for example, on Teams, if somebody sends you a message, you can save the message and you can go back to it. Whereas with Zoom, once the session's closed, it just seems like it disappears, or there's this odd archive of text and what was shared, but it takes a lot of time to kind of go back and look for it. So it feels like Teams is better organized in that sense to create a community and a space for learning. I don't know what the advantages of Zoom are other than kind of messaging somebody privately within the same chat. I found that kind of cool. And like all these effects that they beautify you and they put the fancy background. But
are you able to do like the little breakout rooms or things on Teams as well? Because I find that a lot of teachers use Zoom for that as well.
Yeah. So I think, that was a bit of a fault in it, I suppose, at the beginning, because they didn't have the breakout room option.
Yes.
But we found a way around it where it turns out you can create multiple calls within a channel. So we would just organize students and we would say, your group 1, start a call. We couldn't do the breakout sessions, but you could send them into different calls in one channel where they could interact with one another. And that was like the student autonomy, where you could just assign somebody to take a leading role and start a call and everybody else would join. Now they have the feature. So I think they've stolen that from Zoom, I suppose.
Yes.
So it does work. And we've used it and it works fine. And I quite like it.
I will probably use breakout rooms in 95% of my lessons because I think it's a great tool. And like you said, Vero, I was using Teams a year and a half ago, and there was a lot of things missing in it. But over time, they've gradually implemented or borrowed from other places. And now it's, if you have a course of more than 5 students, I would say definitely use Teams. Zoom's fine for one-on-one or small groups. That's okay. But you'd need to back that up with something else like an LMS or a platform online or a website to host everything. So it can be tricky. But I mean, cheap plug here, but my upcoming book, which is almost out, talks about the advantages and disadvantages of Zoom, Teams, Google Classrooms, and so on. So I've actually looked at this in quite a lot of detail, which is great. So
I'd love to proofread that chapter.
Yeah, absolutely. Stay tuned. Yeah.
And then I definitely love to read the book when it comes out.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Vero, what would you say are the most time-consuming elements of building a course that teachers should be aware of? And, if they're independent teachers or they teach for themselves, what kind of costs could they expect?
Right. I think it could be a little bit expensive depending on your budget. I suppose, kind of your idea of poor and rich is very different depending on how much you earn. But I had to buy a laptop, for example, because my old one just could not keep up anymore. And technology kind of moves quite quickly. You can do a lot with quite a little bit. So I don't think you need to invest like tens of thousands of pounds into a system. But as long as you have, for example, if you want to go with Teams, the Microsoft Office package is quite handy, because then if you have Microsoft Office, you can then have access to Teams, Outlook, all these features that comes with it. So I'm not sure how much that costs in terms of the online package to buy. A good laptop, internet connection. I think these are some basic things that would be enough to work with. I know some teachers would prefer to have like a good microphone and a good headset and things like that. If you kind of in time and your budget allows it, I think that would definitely make your course better. There's also all sorts of like additional platforms that you can integrate within Teams. So there's ways that you can add, other features. Like I know we've done Kahoots, and I've used like things like Nearpod, which is another platform where you can do little activities. So if those you want to invest in that to have the license, so you can depending how big you want to go, that might be an option. But I think overall, as long as you can have like a decent broadband system and a computer, I think, and obviously the package, so the license for Zoom or Teams to use it. Yeah. And then kind of go from there. There's loads of free resources online.
What would you say are the most time-consuming elements? What took you and your colleague the longest amount of time to put everything on? Where you thought, like, I did not expect that to take 3 days?
Yeah, I think it's just really finding ways to fit a technology in a context of education. So how do we adapt this to make it adequate for a classroom? So things like, adapting the materials in terms of, if we don't have breakout rooms, how do we organize this? If we don't have I don't know, how to share your screen and things like that. How do we train people to do this? Because obviously certain teachers didn't have the knowledge, or they didn't have the need before. So then, training them. So I think things like that. And there were things that we didn't realize at the beginning, and then we would hit a wall. And then we'd go back and say, oh, okay, we figured out that, for example, this doesn't work. So, or that there are limitations to certain things.
So it's kind of a troubleshooting process, right? A trial and error to some extent.
No, I mean, what I wanted to say is that we struggled at the beginning because we were not IT people. We were just teachers trying to sort this out. Later in the term, we actually got IT support. And these people came in and said, oh, actually, you've done quite a lot to know, like, given the amount of knowledge you had. And then once we had their support, we could actually go a bit forward and say, there's an issue with SharePoint, which is related to Teams, which then causes this issue in terms of, organizing our documents and whatever. Can you help us fix it? And then they would tell us what it is because they had the knowledge. Yeah. And it was something internal from the system that we didn't know about. Whereas other times, I think it was just like Daniel said, troubleshooting, where we just had to kind of learn that, guest accounts have limitations. So if you're going to guest account, you can't do certain things on Teams because you don't have the license and you won't allow it. So like, okay, how do we find a way around this? Then what can we do to make it better or to make it as seamless as with a regular account?
I was going to ask you, Faye, just from your experience, because obviously you've just recently, you're in the process of, and you have built a course as a kind of solo independent teacher. So kind of what was the process like for you? What issues did you face? What kind of costs did you expect?
Mine is it's a bit different from Vero's experience, because mostly your courses, from what I understand, are more like a live lesson online, right? In my case, it's sort of a blended course. So I have the recorded videos, the recorded lessons that students can go through. And then we have a weekly live lesson to go over questions and to do some practice. So for me, in my case, definitely the hardest thing was learning video editing, creating all the accompanying PDFs and hosting them online on the platform, and creating just making use of all the features that the platform I use has. Now for when I do the live lessons, as you were talking about all the features of Teams and all that, I'm probably not going to be using all those features because the students already have the PDFs, they've already done the practice. So there is like you said, there's a lot of flipped learning happening because they have to do all the learning on their own first. But in my case, it was more, what you said resonated as well. It's more about learning the technology and learning what can and cannot be done. And everything you do for the first time takes longer, right?
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, now that you've said it, I relate to that as well, kind of looking at, because I had no idea how we had to do a lot of recordings for teacher training and for students as well. And I had no idea how to edit them, like screen recordings, things like that. You had to just start from scratch. And I just keep it very basic because I don't have the skills or the patience or the time to video edit. So I just try to do it in one take, and then I go over it over and over until I do it in one take. So I suppose that kind of is time consuming because you have to keep rehearsing and make sure that, and talking to yourself is weird.
Oh yeah. And after you've said something like 50 times, it starts in your head, it starts to sound so unnatural, and you start to second guess everything. And then the imposter syndrome kicks in again.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
That's true. But now, just to kind of wrap things up, having done all that and going through all that, what advice would you give to online English teachers who are just getting started teaching online in 2021?
Yeah, I think the first thing is be brave. I think because a lot of people tend to be intimidated by technology and just kind of say, oh, if it's online, I'm not going to do it. There's so many free resources, like I said, online. There's YouTube videos. There's loads of Microsoft resources as well, if you do choose to go the Teams way, available. Be curious. I think that will be another thing, because, again, be keen to learn. And kind of try to, this is a bit of a difficult thing, I think, because there's an issue of time and availability, but we kind of have to keep ahead of the game, so kind of always look out for what updates are coming up, what things are available, because oftentimes I would turn on Teams and it would just look different. And I would have, what happened? I had no idea what was going on. But they do have a page where they kind of say, oh, we're updating on so-and-so date. Watch out for this. And then at least if you kind of know you're ready for it, but you also know how to adapt your lessons and your plan or your course to fit what's coming and back things up. I suppose that as well for online is always vital. Save things, put them aside. It's easy to lose things. So keeping organized as we would to face, I think it's important to have like a digital tidying of our materials to make sure that
we've lost some recordings and interviews in the past, so it happens. So just to try to learn from it, and I guess learning to fail is a huge thing, and not being intimidated by making mistakes and getting things wrong. I mean, teaching live classes, sometimes I might mess something up or get something wrong, but we laugh about it and we say, well, it's a learning opportunity, right?
Yeah, but we have to practice what we preach, because I always tell my students, don't be afraid to make mistakes. Don't be afraid to get out of your comfort zone and do something else. So then in the same vein, as teachers, we should probably follow through with our advice and, be brave and do find resources and information. And I think these days with technology, I suppose it can be a bit intimidating, but once you kind of get the hang of it, they're quite intuitive, these things. So nothing bad can happen at the click of a button, I suppose. I don't know. Maybe some bad things can happen. Maybe some bad things can happen, but as long as you don't put your card information and security number and things like that, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely.
By clicking a YouTube video, it just takes you to a new one, so you might just find something new to learn.
Definitely brings some new challenges that we have to kind of be aware of going forward. The major thing right now for me is about privacy, about students sharing each other's email addresses and phone numbers, which might seem innocent, but that has a lot of implications as well. So definitely lots of things to think about.
Great. Well, that was all really great to hear. Lots of really practical advice there. Thank you so much for that, Vero.
Thank you for listening and asking me to be here.
Alrighty, thank you so much for joining us today, Vero, and thank you everyone for listening to our episode today.
Yeah, and remember to subscribe to receive the latest episodes each Wednesday. You can follow us on Instagram at ESL Talk Podcast, or you can send us an email to esltalkpodcast@gmail.com. And you can also find me on Instagram at Learning with Faye. Faye is Fey.
Or at I'm Daniel Teacher. That's all we have time for this week. Be sure to join us again next week for another new episode of ESL Talk.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe for new episodes and to follow us on Instagram and Facebook for even more ESL teaching content.